So AJ will fight either, we're led to believe, the winner of Zhilei Zhang against Deontay Wilder, or the winner, and I think this is more likely because it comes with the IBF number 1 position, of Filip Hrgovic and Daniel Dubois. So, Eamon, I'll ask you first of all, how likely do you think it is that AJ fights either of the winners of those 2 fights? And who do you think will come through those 2?
Yeah, for all intents and purposes, it seems to be that Joshua is fighting on that date. That's September, right? You mentioned, and that's supposed to be the date for Wembley. So I guess he's the penciled-in headliner for whatever that Wembley card is. Now, a penciled-in headliner that features half the equation being anti-Joshua needs a really big other side to that equation. And if you go by what Eddie Hearn has said to us in the past, he said that anti-Joshua's next fight will be for the world title or for the unified titles, undisputed titles, whatever it is. So if you look at that from what Eddie Hearn has said from that point, it's likely to be the Dubois versus Hrgovic winner. Either of those, British interest in Dubois. There's the old sparring story where Dubois apparently, was it knocked out or knocked down Joshua?
I think knocked down.
Knocked down Joshua. So yeah, Dubois used that as a bit of a calling card, wasn't it, in the past before I think it was before he turned pro, at least in the very infancy of his pro career, as one of the things to sell himself on. So it would be good to see Joshua also touch the next generation, as well as Dubois looks to cement himself as one of the top dogs in the upcoming next generation. Filip Hrgovic doesn't quite do it as a headliner, if I'm honest, but he might be the winner. On the other side of the equation, 2 fights that we've wanted to see to some degree, one of them being Wilder. We want to see to a massive degree, and to get that in the UK would be absolutely huge. Wilder has to recover the Wilder side of himself, the big punching bronze bomber of himself. Can he do that against Zhilei Zhang? Zhilei Zhang is the other one who there's been talks about that fight happening, but over in China. And I don't know if maybe they might want to reserve that for maybe potentially happening in the future if they can get that Chinese funding, which has never really seemed to be an interest actually when it comes to the Chinese government wanting to have boxing over in China. So maybe that's actually been something that's been silently, or at least in the background, X'd out. But of the two fights, you'd rather see from the 2 sides, you'd rather see AJ and Dubois, and you'd rather see AJ versus Wilder. Now, if those 2 were coming off as the 2 potential fights, one has the world title, the other one is a big rivalry that needs to be settled for me. And I would want to see AJ versus Wilder over wanting to see AJ versus Dubois, even though it carries a world title. But whether that's a decision for, well, Joshua apparently is the boss, as Eddie Hearn says. Is that Joshua's decision? Is that Joshua's desire? I'm not so sure. He's talked about wanting to be the world champion for the 3rd time so nice he had to do it thrice. And I think that might be that's probably more of the moment. You can kind of see the glitter coming down at the end of the night at Wembley and those being the pictures. So maybe they'll go that route. But for me, I'd like to see I want to know what the people in the chat would rather see. Would they rather see that crowning moment, 3rd time? Would they rather see a rivalry be settled between Joshua and Wilder?
Well, Stuart in the chat says AJ versus Fury in September. Wembley is already booked. Now, I've obviously seen that floating about, but I'd imagine it will take a team of very high-priced lawyers, going back to law, to get Fury out of a rematch with Alexander Usyk, regardless of who wins that first fight. But as you point out, Eamon, we do expect the IBF Heavyweight Championship to be vacated or stripped from the winner of the first fight between Fury and Usyk on May the 18th. Or once the first bell rings, perhaps, or it could be a little bit after that. And then, yeah, it would be on the line for the June the 1st fight between Hrgovic and Dubois. And then, yeah, I would imagine the safe route for AJ, if he does want to fight Fury or Usyk, whoever comes out on top of those 2 fights in the future, would be for him to take on Hrgovic and put himself, or Dubois, and put himself in that position as the IBF champion. And then he goes into a potential undisputed fight, which will be the second, because the second Fury Usyk won't be for all the belts. It'll be the second undisputed heavyweight title fight in the 4-belt era. And AJ comes in not only with his star power as leverage, but also one of the belts on offer. So it gets him a bit more in terms of negotiations. So I would imagine that's more likely. But Hrgovic, if he looks impressive against Dubois, and it'll be the first time Hrgovic has looked truly impressive for a number of fights, He'll then want a sizable chunk to face AJ at Wembley, you would think, and he'd deserve it as well, because he'd have beaten someone in Dubois better than anyone Joshua's beaten in his last 3 fights. So I think that's fair enough. On the flip side, I'd like to still see AJ against Wilder, but that's predicated upon Wilder looking somewhat back to his best against Zhilei Zhang. I don't see him taking Zhang out with one killer shot. I just don't see Zhang having a chin that can be busted quite so easily. I could see Zhang gassing towards the later part of the fight. I could see Wilder overwhelming him, catching him with a shot that hurts him and then following up to have the referee step in. But I'm not sure we'll see a textbook Wilder concussive performance against Zhang, even if he wins. But then is Joshua against Wilder a fight that will always sell regardless, unless Wilder looks as bad as he did against Joseph Parker not too long ago? You've got to think there's still money in that fight. DB Cooper 1 says, I don't think he fights Fury, but I'm more interested in what the undercard would be. New 5 versus 5. For example, if Hamza Shiraz wins, have him versus Eubank Jr., who can sign for Eddie. Cracking fight. I'm sure the most exciting part of that for Eddie would be having Chris Eubank Jr. sign for him, to be honest. Toeboy66 says, AJ will fight Wilder next at Wembley. I also think he will rematch Parker, maybe twice till the Fury-Usyk saga is rematched. Going to be 12 months at a minimum for AJ versus Fury. Fair point. Diddy Scott talking about the triple glazing says Mayweather loves windows. Stuart says, how much value will AJ versus Fury have left if Fury loses back-to-back against Usyk? AJ versus Fury in September makes sense, especially with Hrgovic wanting his shot. I think AJ Fury will always sell in the same way that Brook versus Khan still sold many years after their prime. I think AJ's already lost back-to-back to Usyk, so Fury doing the same doesn't necessarily devalue their fight. It still settles who's the best heavyweight in Britain and of their generation in Britain as well. More to the point, I don't see Fury losing back-to-back to Usyk. I think Fury wins the first fight, and then we'll wait and see what happens with the rematch. But either way, I think AJ versus Fury will always sell. It'll always be there. And I know we used to say that about Khan and Brook. Khan was always chasing those fights with Mayweather and Pacquiao and didn't get either of those. And it was like, well, you've wasted your career doing that. Now the Brook fight's gone. But they did eventually fight. And while it wasn't what it would have been in their prime, and maybe Khan would have had a better chance in their prime as well, it was still an entertaining fight, and they both still made a huge amount of money. I think the pay-per-view buys were good too. So, yeah, I think AJ Fury will always have value. I know it's strike while the iron's relatively hot, lukewarm, perhaps. But I think we'll still get it. I just don't think we'll get it until after Fury-Usyk twice. I think it'd be very difficult. They got over the line on Fury-Usyk with massive help from Turki Al-Sheikh, of course, getting back to our first topic, partly because they inserted a rematch as part of the overall package. I think it'd be very difficult now for Fury to extricate himself from that, regardless of what happens in the first fight and regardless of what's on the table in September. But we shall see.